the next panel is going to be exploring the pathways between biodiversity and human health. I don't know about you, but I definitely want to hear this. And our moderator is Dr. Josefine Gibson, who is the deputy editor at the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health. Welcome, Josefine, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Shola. What an incredible day to be speaking and to join you all today. So yeah, this session is going to be addressing the question of less biodiversity, more disease, but I'm not on my own. I'm joined by a fantastic panel, and I'll introduce you one by one. Here they pop up on our screens. So first, we have Dr. Lewis Collins. So Lewis brings to this panel experience and expertise in earth science and climate change research. So Lewis did his doctoral and postdoctoral research in Antarctica, and that has sharpened his focus on environmental change. Lewis now works in the publishing world, like I do, and he is editor-in-chief of One Health, which is Cell Press's flagship sustainability journal. So next we've got Dr. Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka. So Gladys is founder and CEO of Conservation Through Public Health. That's an award-winning NGO that protects endangered gorillas and other wildlife through One Health approaches. So Gladys has a veterinary background, graduating from the Royal Veterinary College here in London. She established Uganda Wildlife Authority's first veterinary department and has built her research on disease within the human, livestock, wildlife interface through masters and residencies in veterinary science. She has founded Gorilla Conservation Coffee to support farmers living around habitats where gorillas are found, and she leads now numerous councils and organizations. So it's really special that she's here with us today. Virginia Gardner is the inventor and CEO of Loowatt toilet system. So her company creates sustainable toilets with waterless flush technology that can capture odor and convert waste into electricity, biogas, and fertilizer. Virginia developed this technology during her master's degree in innovation design engineering. Before founding Loowatt in 2010, Virginia spent her time in various director and management roles in product and design companies focused on environment and human health. And finally, Dr. Esther Kanduma is senior lecturer and animal health scientist based in the University of Nairobi in Kenya. Esther has 2 decades of teaching, research, and public engagement experience, and her interests in research revolve around epidemiology, control, and management of animal diseases, particularly in tick-borne diseases. Esther is currently leading a World Academy of Sciences Elsevier Gender Equity Climate Action Project. Sorry, that was a very long one. That's based in Kenya, and there Esther is helping pastoral women and girls severely affected by the current drought and famine to adapt to climate change. So everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to trying to unpick this question on less diversity, more disease. If I could start with a really fundamental question about the relationship between biodiversity and health to really help us understand the central questions. Can I have your thoughts on how biodiversity impacts human health? Lewis, perhaps we could start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me here today. I think we hear quite a lot about climate change and the impact on health, be it through extreme events, flooding, or just a gradual rise in wet bulb temperatures. But we tend to hear less about the linkages between biodiversity, loss, and human health. And I think for a long time, human health or public health and environmental health have been treated separately by separate communities, and we're increasingly recognizing the interactions between these. I think human health, human well-being, and in many cases, human livelihoods, which I don't think we should overlook, are dependent on services that are provided by the natural world. These ecosystem services, as they're often called, provide us with food, water. They help to regulate the cleanliness of our air, our local climate conditions, and they keep the spread of pathogens in check. They also provide materials that many industries and livelihoods depend on. So we're very much dependent on these services in nature. And the continuation of these services really relies on healthy, functioning ecosystems, and biodiversity or species richness is key to this functioning. If you reduce biodiversity or species richness, then you undermine the functioning and the services they provide. Just like when our bodies are unhealthy, they fail to provide functions. The same is true for the health of the environment. A degraded environment will fail to function, and the services it provides, clean air, clean water, food, raw materials, a stable climate, are essentially reduced and diminished as well. So if we continue to degrade the environment, if we continue to drive biodiversity loss, we're going to see poor air quality increase. So we're talking about declining lung function, a rise in respiratory disease. We're going to see increased polluted waterways and a lack of an ability to filter the waste in these waterways. So we're talking about waterborne diseases increasing, diarrheal disease. If we undermine soil quality and the biodiversity in soils, then we're going to see diminished crop yields, which will increase malnutrition. And of course, if we continue to degrade biodiversity and push into these areas, we're going to increase our exposure to infectious disease. So fundamentally, biodiversity underpins, I would say, all life on Earth, and we're playing with fire if we continue to drive its decline. And I think a key stat to kind of kick things off with is the fact that since the 1970s, there's been a near 70% decline in all the monitored populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish. You know, we're really accelerating this loss, and we need to stop.
Wow, thank you. Gladys, do you have any other thoughts on different dimensions that we should be thinking about in this relationship?
I would say that thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. I would say that another element of biodiversity is the fact that even us as humans also affect the wildlife and affect biodiversity. And zoonotic diseases jump in both directions. There's been a lot of emphasis on zoonotic disease from animals to people, but there is also that element of zoonotic diseases jumping from people back to animals. And especially those that we're so closely related to, like the great apes, where we share over 98% genetic material. We have seen cases of that happening in Uganda and other countries in Africa, and also Southeast Asia. So it's important to look at it both ways, because if animals are not healthy, people won't be healthy. And if people aren't healthy, animals won't be healthy. And the environment, the biodiversity is an interface where, you can have contaminated water, and where people and animals meet, all those sources can be contaminated. So One Health approaches are really needed to try and prevent biodiversity loss and to also prevent diseases being transmitted within the biodiversity.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to the topic of One Health later in our discussion. More specifically, what do you think is the impact of biodiversity on mental health? Esther, I know you've worked in that sort of sphere yourself, having studied severe drought in pastoral societies in Kenya. What do you think of the impact of biodiversity on mental health?
Thank you, Josefine, for having me in this discussion. It's a pleasure for me to participate and also to speak on behalf of the women and girls in pastoral communities that are probably experiencing, the worst effects of climate change and the severe drought and famine that has become quite frequent over the years. So probably what the world may not know is that for quite a number of decades now, there has been, seasons of rainfall that's been disrupted by this ongoing climate crisis. And in the recent years, it's become very frequent. And what we see and what is reported is the loss of animals, for example, the loss of biodiversity in terms of, the plants, the ecology as well. But what we have realized in our projects, going into this community and getting to understand what it is that it has taken them really to bear, not just the famine and the drought, the loss of their livelihoods as well, the loss of food as well, is that they go through a lot of mental torture that nobody seems to understand. And if I'm talking about the pastoral communities in Kenya, they are quite large. 80% of land is covered by these pastoral communities. And for them, their animals, both livestock and wildlife, is a social, cultural heritage. Their livelihoods depend on these animals. And in these droughts, this severe, famine and drought, they lose everything. They lose their animals, they lose vegetation cover, they lose pastures, there's no water, they lose everything, they lose their livelihoods. And then it is so painful, because they're so attached to the animals. You can't separate them from the animals, both the livestock and wildlife. So they lose their animals, and they have no food, they have no water. And for example, when we went in with this project, what we found is a community that was completely devastated. They were devastated not just because of the loss of their animals and the loss of their livelihoods, but also because many were going without food. So for these communities, they depend on milk and meat from the animals. They don't farm. So you can imagine there was a drought everywhere, not just even in this, arid lands. So there was drought everywhere. There was no food to eat. So, and nobody seemed to think about, the mental torture that they were going through to sleep hungry, really to see young children, mothers with young children, and they have nothing to feed them. They have no milk for the animals to feed them. They have no food. They have no access to anything. So what we have realized is that there is more than just the physical loss, the asset loss and the loss of biodiversity, but there is also a lot of mental, well-being that really accompanies this kind of climate change, environmental losses that these communities go through. And nobody seems to realize that, so that even as they are suffering the loss, then they can actually give them support, psychological support to bear the loss. And we have had ourselves, we are not really psychologists, we were also, all of us were affected because progressively the drought started small, and then became severe, and it picked up, and everything was literally dying. And when we met the women and the girls, because usually in pastoral communities the women are left to tend the sheep and the goats, so the message we got is that even in this drought, the worst of the drought is that it has also killed their sheep and goats. Before, they could see the livestock, the big animals die, but this one had also taken their goats, and this is their livelihood. So, and they were staring at death themselves. So I remember one woman saying, "You are the scientists, tell us, should we stare at death just approaching because all the animals have died?" So my experience is that we need to look more into this, effect of loss of livelihood, because they have lost the pastures, they have no water, they have lost the animals. We need to also really think about this state of well-being to help them cope, so that they do not completely despair, because I had seen a community that had completely despaired. And then one more thing I want to add is also that, when we have lost this, biodiversity, their pastures have gone, their animals have died, their wildlife has died as well, we have seen an increase in conflicts, because anywhere where there's some little pastures of water they can feed give the animals to drink, there is an increase in conflict. So for this particular group, for example, we heard from all of them, we have a group of 50 women that they can report that they have had a conflict over small issues, because they are fighting for limited resources because of the drought. Their men had left home, many months. In fact, for this particular group, they said that late last year, when the drought was picking up, their men had left with the pastures. They had moved to look for greener pastures. So the women were left alone. And even when we were going through this loss of goats, they usually move with cattle. Then the women are left with the goats and the sheep. Then they had been left on their own. Their older sons had also gone out with their dads, really in search of pastures. So the women were very lonely, suffering alone with their kids, without food, without water, with no psychological support. And for the government, when it's concentrating on providing food relief, they forget about this human, support that should be there as well because at the end of the day, we need people who are full of hope that the rains will come or some help will come and will come on time. And what our group did is that when we went, we decided that we wanted to really support them first psychologically, give them hope, make them comfortable, not because we were providing a lot of food or anything, for them to feel that as scientists, we are working very hard to resolve the climate crisis, to give them hope that, yes, this time is painful, it has been difficult, but there is hope that if you continue, the things that we are proposing to do, there is hope that we reduce the periods of the seasons of these recurrent droughts, but also eventually that, they can do something also to improve the situation. So this has been our experience with this, the Maasai women and girls. And from that time, you could, even when you interact with them, you can see that they are positive. And I think that's the best thing we can do, make them look at everything positively, even in the midst of this crisis, that they are positive, there is hope in the future. So that's been our experience. I think I will share more as we move forward. Josefine.
Thank you very much, Esther. That's really fascinating. And I'm sure many of those crises and those mental health shocks that you speak about from Kenya are also are similar to the shocks that are experienced when weather disrupts your community, or flooding and all sorts. So thank you for that. Esther and Gladys, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the role of biodiversity in protecting against the spread of disease. Gladys, you already mentioned the importance of One Health, but can we talk a little bit about the mechanisms through which this protection against disease happens and how the protection crumbles in the absence of biodiversity?
Yes, biodiversity has a very big role to play. If we destroy it, then we're more likely to have an increase in zoonotic diseases. You tend to find that, I'm going to give a typical example where we work at Bwindi Impenetrable National Park. We founded conservation through public health based on experiences I had working as a first vet for the Uganda Wildlife Authority. And when this happened, I was hired because they were concerned about diseases that could come from tourists to gorillas, such as fatal flus, when gorilla tourism had just begun. But actually, fatal flu such as COVID-19. But actually what happened in the end was disease from the local community. Because when you get to Bwindi, the first thing that struck me when I first arrived as a vet student was a very hard edge between the community and the park. Almost everywhere, there's a very hard edge. The cultivation stops and the forest begins. And this means that once it became a national park, people couldn't enter to cut trees unless they were only coming in for tourism or research activities. But gorillas could come out, and they tend to come out because once they lose their fear of people, after having been habituated for tourism or research, they go back to the places they used to range before their habitat was cut. And when they come across to these places, they find unhealthy, unhygienic habits, open defecation, dirty clothing on scarecrows, and they picked up scabies, which resulted in the death of an infant, and the others only recovered after we treated them with ivermectin. And then there was another outbreak later on, a few more years later, and this was the same problem of people and wildlife mixing with each other. There's all kinds they put out dirty clothing on scarecrows to scare away gorillas, baboons, and other wildlife. So there's a lot of mixing of people and wildlife at the interface. And so when we destroy biodiversity, when we cut down trees, there's no buffer zone, there's a hard edge everywhere, there's very likely to have a very large human, wildlife, and livestock interface. And this ends up resulting in disease spreading in both directions. It's the same in areas where you have a lot of cattle, let's say in savanna parks. We've done some work at Queen Elizabeth National Park, which has pastoralists, and you tend to find that diseases are spreading between the cattle and the people. And in a lot of this is due to people grazing their cattle in the park, which is illegal actually, but it used to be part of their places where they used to graze cattle before it became a national park. And the wildlife also goes to the community. and you get this spread of diseases such as tuberculosis, brucellosis, anthrax is another one. We've had hippos dying of anthrax, and cattle grazing with them picking up anthrax, spreading it to the communities, their owners, outside the park. People also directly eating bushmeat. Poaching is another area of disrupting biodiversity and directly picking up diseases from bushmeat, such as anthrax or Ebola in places like Central Africa. So it's this whole thing of disrupting nature, disrupting the environment, which tends to result in a larger interface for diseases to jump back and forth, viral diseases, parasitic diseases, like scabies, intestinal parasites. We're worried about the animals picking up salmonella, cholera, but even, disease passes in both directions. And so it's very important not to avoid deforestation, swamp reclamation. All of these things all contribute to an increase in zoonotic diseases jumping back and forth. And some of the things we do in the community is actually encourage people to plant trees so that when they need firewood, they don't have to enter the forest. We discourage them from eating bushmeat. We encourage them to be healthy and hygienic. We support community health workers and teach them to do conservation work. We call them community conservation health workers, or in Uganda, because they're called village health teams. In Uganda, we call them village health and conservation teams. And they promote good hygiene and sanitation. They also promote good health-seeking behavior. If you have scabies, TB, HIV suspected, go to the health centers for immediate treatment, or COVID. They also encourage community-based family planning so people can have manageable families. Because again, if you have very large family sizes, it's less likely to be able to feed them. Food security becomes more of an issue, and you're driven to enter the park to poach and collect firewood. You need more firewood and more meat to feed 10 children as opposed to 4 or less. And then also you can't break the poverty cycle. The children won't go to school. They'll always depend on the forest to survive. And then it's a continuous cycle of poverty that can't be broken.
Indeed.
And then we promote, they also talk about, people being healthy and hygienic, and they basically combine conservation and health messages together. And in this way, we're using this One Health approach that addresses the health of people, animals, and environment together to minimize this threat of zoonotic disease transmission and minimize destruction of biodiversity.
And you're also talking about the power of public engagement in combating this trend, right? And Esther, I wonder if you have experience with your work in public engagement and how important it is to eradicate myths, or bust myths rather, and to help educate the people who are in the communities and who are making those day-to-day decisions that will slowly change the biodiversity. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. I think I also wanted to add to what Gladys is saying, and from the perspective of the kind of research that I do with the animal diseases, is that when we maintain a stable ecosystem, then we are able to maintain also a stable ecosystem for example, disease vectors. So if I use the case of, for example, tick-borne diseases, these are vector diseases. So ticks are vectors that transmit tick-borne pathogens. So when we look at these type of diseases, usually animals, livestock, and wildlife and vegetation have a role to play in the spread of tick-borne diseases. And this also includes the zoonotics that Gladys is talking about. So there is usually a natural reservoir for this, pathogen, and there is also a natural reservoir for this vector. So if you want to maintain a stable disease condition, then you need to maintain a stable ecosystem, a stable ecology, because when you disrupt this, then you disrupt the disease cycles, and this is a problem. So, for example, when we talk about the pastoralists again, we really discourage them from, they have to move in search of pastures, but we tell them, when you move, then you're going to meet new vegetation cover, you're exposing your animals to new disease vectors, you're also exposing yourself to new, for example, this could be mosquito bites, and so many other diseases. So there is an importance in the, trying to control the spread of, infectious diseases, in maintaining a stable, ecology, a stable ecosystem, and making sure that, for example, even in terms of natural reservoirs of animal and human diseases, you do not disturb that balance. Because if you do, then I think each of these organisms has a role to play, in the ecosystem. They will, if the natural reservoir is not there, they'll have to find another natural reservoir. So we have all evolved, humans, animals, and plants. We have all co-evolved, to live with each other. And for example, we know when you look at the distribution of animals, plants, and microorganisms as well, we are very, for example, in the Malaria belts in sub-Saharan Africa, we have lived with these parasites for a very long time. We have developed natural immunity to them. We cannot really suffer very severe malaria, so to say, unlike someone else who has not co-evolved with this, being exposed to these organisms. So in this way, biodiversity plays a role in stopping the spread of diseases because it maintains a balance, and this balance is important in not interrupting those disease cycles, both for for the vector, but also for the parasite that is being passed on, and depends on, for example, the ecology or the humidity or the temperature. So when there's a balance, then we have humidity that is right, we have the right temperature, and so then we cannot disturb these vectors and the vector pathogens. But also, we are trying as much as possible to educate, really the policymakers, and especially with regards to this movement, transborder movement of animals, in a way, because when the communities are moving in search of pastures, in search of water, when they are doing, transborder trade, then they are spreading diseases. They are spreading diseases. So maintaining and making sure that, for example, they reforest, then maintaining that there is a proper management of, the cover, the forest cover. This ensures that we limit the movement of animals, we limit the movement of people, so that then the zoonotics, really, they do not end up being exposed to these zoonotics. So we are talking so much, and especially with regards to pastoralism, because they tend to move. They can move really from southern Kenya, sometimes from Tanzania all the way to northern Kenya in search of pastures. So we are trying to talk to the policy makers, for example, to promote, practices that conserves the biodiversity, conserves the environment, so that then the communities can stay. They can stay where they are adapted, where they have co-evolved, they are well protected. And this is something I remember I wrote a policy to really, as one of the measures to stop spread of tick-borne diseases, that even this co-grazing with wildlife should stop when they move into the parks and the national, conservancies in search of pastures. Then they are exposing themselves to a lot of diseases just because they have lost, their natural pastures. So I think it is something that really needs to be, yes, and I say that we are trying also to support these communities survive. And in the face of climate change, it has become really so bad, such that even when naturally you'd expect that during the rainy seasons they have good, cover, natural cover, that they can have their animals get enough pastures, this is lacking. But we are promoting regenerative agriculture, we are promoting conservation agriculture to ensure that, even during bad times, they still have something that really limits their movement in search of pastures, and also not really going around in search of trade, for example, moving the animals to go and sell them in Tanzania or in Uganda, and in the process spreading a lot of diseases, but also picking a lot of diseases along the way.
Thank you, Esther. That's really interesting. Virginia, I'd like to turn to you now, because you sort of bring some innovation, design, engineering expertise to this group. And with your invention of the Loowatt, you've thought a lot about the role of sustainability and safe sanitation, all what we all know as SDG 5. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that, on sustainable and safe sanitation, and that role in protecting biodiversity and human health.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick point to note, it's the sanitation SDG is SDG 6. but the overall importance of sanitation in the Sustainable Development Goals is quite well documented. And a recent study from the University College London has shown that by improving sanitation, you actually impact all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, so there's a really important role for it to play. And there's absolutely many links, very real links to biodiversity with sanitation. And I think, you know, one of the things that I sometimes like to say is that even on, as people, as human beings, even on our least productive days, we still will be producing about 1 to 1.5 kilograms of human waste, urine and feces, that's going to go somewhere. And we're also going to be eating food which needs to be grown using you know, nutrients that need to be cycled back into the system. And this is something that we like to forget because it's, you know, for many reasons that I think are deep in our psychology. But the reality is that by not dealing with it, we are absolutely creating havoc on biodiversity, especially in freshwater ways and also seawater and, you know, ocean environments. And also at the same time, there's an opportunity for there to be a more optimal relationship between our fecal output, for lack of a better term, and the inputs that we require to live. So, you know, most of the nutrients that you know, a lot of really important nutrients for plants, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus come out in our urine, and fecal matter is full of bacteria and full of different types of life, and often is, you know, consumed by animals at some point in its decomposition. When I say animals, I'm speaking quite broadly, you know, from microorganisms, but many types. And, you know, speaking of biodiversity, one of the things that happened in our company experience was that we came upon an undocumented species of worm when we were testing out our vermicomposting system in Madagascar. We had a worm scientist looking at all the different worms that were consuming the fecal waste that had been, after it had been anaerobically digested. And, you know, by feeding human waste to worms, you get a very, very rich soil product because the worms process it through their little tubular bodies and create something that's considered, you know, even better than that. You know, it's one of the best fertilizers there is. And this was about 7 years ago. And I guess it's an anecdote, but for me, it really feels pertinent because we found this worm. I say we, but it was a scientist who was working with us at the time. It certainly wasn't me, but I ended up with the job of having to get the worm to somebody who was doing Africa's first worm taxonomy. And I remember it being really surprising that nobody had done a worm taxonomy before, you know, in this massively biodiverse continent, you know, and it doesn't, at the same time, of course, it's not surprising because, you know, the humble worm, you know, hasn't been on the top of mind for everybody. And, you know, I had to actually smuggle the worms in a little vitamin bottle, and I gave them to the guy at Johannesburg airport. Don't tell anybody, so that he could go and do the DNA testing on it. And indeed it was an undocumented worm species. But yeah, I think that sanitation just is intrinsically linked to biodiversity. You know, we carry several pounds of microorganisms with us in our gut all the time, and that stuff's all flowing through us and coming out the other end. And really being aware of that, and also thinking about how we can more optimally have what we produce be part of the cycle in the world around us. You know, it's something that many people have been thinking about for a long time. It's not straightforward. You know, there's many, many complex challenges to it, but it's an absolutely central part of maintaining biodiversity in the world.
Totally. Virginia, thank you so much for dealing with what most of us tend to want to just forget. Lewis, can we come to you and talk a little bit about the medical resources that are so heavily dependent on natural compounds? with diversity loss ongoing, what are the effects going to be on the availability of medicinal resources if we don't act fast?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important point. I think it's well known that humans have relied on nature for remedies for thousands of years, herbal, traditional. How many of us have had a cup of chamomile tea before going to bed to calm us down or soothe us? How many of us have applied aloe vera balm to our bodies? These are all come from nature. Aspirin developed from willow bark, penicillin famously from fungus. Nature has delivered a lot, and not just these kind of more commonplace everyday medicines. Compounds from natural products are being used, cutting edge research for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cancers. So we do rely on nature a huge amount for these medicines. I think one estimate that I read was 80% of registered medicines come from plants or have been inspired by natural products. So there's a big dependence on the natural world for the treatments that we use. And the scary thing is that many of the plants that host these potentially life-saving natural compounds are going extinct before we're even discovering them. I think in 2019 alone, 4,000 new plant and fungi species were discovered in 1 year. But at the same time, we're seeing a massive rate of biodiversity loss in these areas, in these species. Around, I think, 40% of fungi and plant are now threatened with extinction. Imagine the medicinal properties these could have. The key threats are the same as usual. Pollution, shrinking habitats, as humans are encroaching more and more into these ecosystems. We're decreasing their numbers. But I think the medicines are at risk, but something to also consider is that harvesting these medicines, these compounds, is also a driver of biodiversity loss. Demand is increasing as population increases, as antibiotic resistance increases. We're looking for more and more novel compounds to develop newer and newer medicines, more effective medicines. I think a really good example is the blue blood of the horseshoe crab, which is famously used to detect or to test vaccines. I think it was used also in the COVID vaccine.
Indeed.
This is massive for impurities in vaccines, and this is hugely in demand now, to the extent that the blue blood or the horseshoe crab is now classed as a vulnerable species. So there are many opportunities to find more compounds out there. There have been reports from bacteria in the deep ocean that could be threatened by deep sea mining before we even get to develop it. There are discoveries coming from the Amazon rainforest on almost a monthly basis, and deforestation is driving rates of extinction there massively. But we have to think about the balance. We also need to think about the impact that pharmaceuticals are having on biodiversity itself. So I think it's a two-way street, and we have to be careful about looking both ways.
Well, thank you so much. I think what we've really talked about today, and unfortunately we are running out of time, but there's really a theme about how things are going both ways. It's a bi-directional relationship that we need to protect, and a lot of our behavior is really influencing a lot. Gladys, would you like to say one more thing before we need to wrap up?
Yes, I just had one more thing to say. I wanted to say that I've just written a book called Walking with Gorillas, which talks about a lot of what we've all talked about in this session, actually, even from Virginia, Lewis, and Esther. So thanks so much. And it came out this year in March, and it's in the UK
wonderful.
in May.
Well, I'll look it up.
And there's a whole chapter on One Health and all kinds of things, but it's about my conservation and leadership journey shaped by One Health.
Oh, wow. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, panel members. You've been a delight to talk to and really interesting. Good luck with all your work and continued efforts in this field. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.